So, last month I turned 46 years old. Guys, that was the reaction. I needed what? I can't believe you're 40. We'll try it again. Last month I turned 46. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. It's too late. It's too late now. You missed your opportunity. And I know that for some of you that probably feels super old, but actually I feel pretty young still, mainly because every day I realize something I didn't know. Have you guys seen those memes that are like, I was today years old when, and then it shows you some kind of food item or a product or just a random fact that you spent your whole life either not knowing or misusing? You guys familiar with these? I mean, something like this. I had no clue that owls' legs are actually super long and skinny. I spent my whole life thinking they were short and stubby. And who knew? Or even this one, I literally just learned this one this week, and my husband says as many Amazon packages as I get, I should have already known this one, but did you realize that the Amazon logo is actually intended to represent where the smile goes from A to Z, meaning Amazon has everything from A to Z? I'm the only one who didn't know this? Okay, or even this one, have you guys ever noticed in the Toblerone logo, there's a bear in the mountain? Do you guys know that? I was today years old when I realized anybody actually purchases Toblerone or eats it. I didn't even know people actually did that. Now, this morning's conversation is about something that I feel like I learned a little later in life than I should have. I just flew in Friday from spending Thanksgiving with my family in Nashville, and I don't know how your Thanksgiving was, but mine was pretty typical to how it's been every year. We're Southern, so we eat way too much food. It's like a sea of starch at the buffet, very, very few green things actually, and then we settle in after eating too much, watch a little football, and then my dad and his two brothers tell the same stories that they've told every year. Now, I have heard these stories for the last 40 years in a row. They are the exact same story, but what's funny about it is, if you try and tell these stories when it's not the holidays, it just doesn't land. There is something about the holidays that make the same stories I've heard every year just all the funnier. In fact, I actually think just the holidays in general, they're amplifiers. I think the holidays amplify everything. Things that are bright just feel brighter. Things that are cheerier feel even more cheerier. Things that are funny feel even funnier, but also it amplifies other things too. Things that are hard feel just a little harder. Moments that feel stressful feel a little more stressful, and moments where I feel like I'm a little lonely, I feel just a little lonelier. I mean, the holidays amplify what could be joy, hope, excitement, and they end up reminding us of what was or what should be. And oftentimes they end up reminding us of who is no longer with us. And we didn't want to get into the holiday season without at least taking one moment just this week to have a conversation around one of the harder parts of the holidays, and that's grief. Now, when you go to school to be a pastor, you take all sorts of classes. You take polity, homiletics, New Testament, Old Testament. So I wasn't surprised when I took a class called Grief, Transition, and Loss. And I expected to spend the semester learning about how to craft a meaningful memorial service or how to navigate with a family through the loss of someone that they love. And we did talk about those things for maybe a week or two. But that class was so much more. Because grief is so much bigger than we think. In fact, dictionary.com defines grief this way. It says grief is deep sorrow, especially that is caused by someone's death. But I actually have a little bit of a different definition that I think broadens it a little bit. I say that grief is the natural response, what happens in our body, what happens in our mind, what happens with our emotions, when anything that we thought was or should or could be is simply no longer. I like to broaden that definition because I think there are just things we don't think about when it comes to a conversation in grief. Now, this is not the first time this conversation's come up. Actually, grief's been a thing since the beginning of time. If you just look at the Old Testament, we get to see God navigate several moments of grief with his people. I mean, we see things like imprisonment, oppression, political upheaval, death, family drama. We see all sorts of things that cause these moments of grief where God sits with ancient Israel or with individuals. And then we can look in the New Testament and see a similar list where there is loss, there is infertility, there is struggle, there is grief. This is by no means a new conversation, but this morning I want to spend our entire time looking at what I think is the most, history's most iconic grief narrative. I want to look at the story of Job. So we're going to look at the entire book of Job, 42 chapters. Are you ready? Settle in. We're actually not going to read 42 chapters together. What we're going to do, though, is look at the arc of the story and then just kind of drop in at a few key moments that have really helped me process when life just doesn't make sense. So we're going to look at all 42 chapters, all with the goal of asking ourselves, what do we do? What do these chapters mean to me when life just doesn't make sense? Now, we start right out of the gate with Job. Here's what we read. There lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Sounds like a great guy. That's verse 1. And right out of the gate, in what feels super shocking and super unsettling, Job starts to experience grief. We read this. His first losses are this. He loses his oxen and his donkeys. They're stolen, and all of his servants are killed in a raid. Then his sheep are burned in a fire. His camels are stolen. Job loses everything, and I want to stop here first. You know, I think there are things we don't consider in the grief category, and if we don't understand what happens if we are experiencing grief and we haven't named it, we haven't identified it, it will actually end up kind of spilling over around ourselves and our lives and those that we love. And Job has actually lost everything. He's lost his livelihood, his security, his business. Now, I know that Jesus tells us often and tells his audiences over and over, hey, don't get too attached to things, right? Your houses, your donkeys, your oxen, they can all disappear at any moment, so don't get too attached. But that doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't understand that when we lose something we have worked hard for, it can be difficult to navigate. Just ask anybody that lost a job this year. Ask anybody that filed for bankruptcy recently. Ask anyone that spent their whole life saving up for that dream car and then within 6 months it's totaled. There are things we just don't think to grieve. You know, and the church is really good at coming alongside us when we are grieving the loss of someone we love. In fact, you are not usually even connected to a church community and you'll go, well, I need a pastor to pray by a graveside, or I need to go to a church to have a memorial service. But when it comes to some of these other things, we don't know what to do in those moments. We don't have funerals for a job loss. When our best friend moves away, we don't have a memorial service. We aren't quite sure how to navigate these things, even though they still deeply impact us. Are there things that happened to you this year where you lost a job maybe, or a big transition? You know, about 6-7 years ago, I did that. I walk right into that every single time. I know, 6-7 years ago. Yes, we moved here, and I had worked at my last job for 13 years. And right before I left, someone said to me, hey, Jen, you know, when you move, it will be really hard to rebuild what you spent the last 13 years building. And I was like, nah, I got this. I'm fine. I'll get a new job. I'll land. They were right. I had to grieve what I moved from, friendships that I was no longer close to, purpose and meaning that I thought I had. I had to process that. My dad was a fireman my entire life. And time again, we would get to come alongside a family that had lost everything in a house fire. Now, oftentimes their family was safe and they wouldn't trade that for anything. But losing everything they owned was difficult. Job loses everything. Safety, security, livelihood, his business. If you've had that happen to you this year, you spent a lot of time and money in a business deal and it went bad. That's not nothing. If you had a valued item that was lost or stolen, that's not nothing. See, life just has a way of happening, and when life doesn't go as we plan, we will grieve. Now, Job has lost everything, but we're not done. A great wind collapses the house where all of his children are celebrating, and they are all killed. Job loses all of his children. You know, we just wrapped up a series called Forever Matters, and we just spent the whole time looking at what we think or how what we think about eternity does or should shape how we live today. So when we're considering what happens to us and those we love when they are no longer with us, these conversations are for sure connected. But this morning, I really want us to consider actually something a little different, because I think there are ways that people leave us in all sorts of ways. I think we lose relationships in ways before people are physically gone. I can remember standing at a funeral with a woman who had lost her father, and she wasn't particularly close to him. But she said, you know what's harder for me right now, what I'm grieving right now is actually not the physical absence of my father, because that's what I've known, but the hope that maybe our relationship could be restored. When a marriage ends, when a friendship ends, when we have to move and relocate, or we switch jobs and we're no longer close to those coworkers, or when our children that we have hoped and prayed and had vision for their future life choose a very different path. There are all sorts of ways that relationships get cut off. We are made to be connected. And when our relationships get severed for any reason and in any way, we will experience grief. And that grief will vary by the depth of the relationship. I get it. Sometimes it's just a tinge of disappointment all the way to you will feel like you have a hole the size of the Grand Canyon in your heart forever. Job loses everything. And he almost loses everyone. And you would think, isn't that enough? But no. Job actually, then his physical health gets attacked when he is struck with painful sores from his head to his toes. Now, I can remember being younger and going to Kmart with my grandmother. Who remembers Kmart? Yep, 46-year-olds in the house. Yep, yeah, I get it, yeah. So we would go to Kmart and we would get there in the line and the cashier would say, "How are you, ma'am?" And my grandmother would answer, even though like we're all supposed to know they don't actually mean it. And she would go on a tirade about her health and in detail. And as a younger person, I would be so mortified until now I could write you a dissertation on colorectal health. And I am lobbying for bidets and squatty potties in the new building. Because it doesn't matter till it matters. When we talk about losses, we're not talking about just loss of life, but sometimes we're talking about loss of life as we know it. And sometimes that includes loss of function. If you suffer from debilitating migraines or something impacts you physically and you are no longer able to show up as you used to, sometimes not even show up at all, you will experience grief. A loss of hearing can actually leave you out of conversations, and a loss of mobility could have you trapped at home. And when you can't show up at work the way that you're used to or show up for others the way that you're used to, what does that do to your sense of meaning and purpose? Any kind of loss will extract some kind of price in our life. Job not only loses everything and nearly everyone, but he loses his abilities to function. Has something happened with your physical health? Has something happened where you're no longer able to function the way that you feel like you should, or something has got you paralyzed or crippled, or maybe you're physically fine, but there's actually something that's gone on in your mind, like PTSD or a near miss and an accident, and what's happened is your whole world has been reoriented and you've just not named it as grief. Now, Job suffers all these things, and I want to spend some time now looking at people that are around Job and how they respond. So let's start with his wife and her response. Job's wife says this. You've lost everything. She's lost everything too. Job's wife says this. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Are you still doing all this God stuff? Are you still going to be a man that's upright and blameless? Look at how all that's paid off for you. Curse God and die." You know, I kind of get it. She's lost everything too. She's lost her children and their livelihood, and she doesn't understand why. I mean, I think if we're honest, we can kind of relate to her in this moment. I think most of us have probably had a moment where we thought, if this is what faith looks like, why would I sign up for any of this? If this is what I get out of saying I believe in God, why would I even say that? Why would I take this path? I am just exhausted by what life has handed me. So I'm in a moment when I feel like I just want to say, curse God and die. I think we get it. And what's Job's response to her? Job responds this way. You're talking like a foolish woman. I'm going to pause here for a second. Gentlemen, no matter what kind of day your wife has, when she comes home, do not lead with this. This is not a strong lead-in, but Job does it. We keep reading. He says, you are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? You know, I've been in ministry a long time, and whenever I'm in a situation or I watch us navigate situations, I know we want the right things to say. I know we want to find the right words. But in my experience, there are really no right words, but What Job offers here, because I've had lots of people try and offer me lots of platitudes when I've been struggling. But what Job says here is actually what I cling to more than anything else now. You know, Sal and I have 2 amazing young men as sons, and we are beyond thankful for them. But there was a baby before our boys. Sal and I experienced a miscarriage in our mid-20s. And it wrecked me. I was so mad, so angry. I had so many questions. I actually just kind of stopped talking to God for about a year. Now, I worked for a church, so I talked a lot about him. I just refused to sit down and have a conversation. You know, and I never felt like God caused our miscarriage, but I absolutely wondered and had questions about why he would allow it. It made no sense to me, and no matter what mental gymnastics that I tried to do or rationale that I tried to have around it, it just didn't make any sense. There were no right words. And then I was at a conference for people who talk about God, and we were singing this song, and it was a new worship song at the time. It was called Blessed Be Your Name. And we were singing this song, and I was singing along because that's what you do, but I didn't really care. We're at the chorus, blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed be the name, blessed be your glorious name. I'm like, yeah. And then we get to the bridge. And the bridge goes, you give and take away. You give and take away. And my heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. And in that moment, I started talking to God again. And when I talked, I had lots of anger, and I had lots of questions. I had real tension and real questions for God, and I think Job does too. We're actually going to get to see later how God actually get Job and God having a conversation, and he asks those questions and presents those tensions, and we're going to get there. But before that, I just want to say, I know we think that if we can find the right words, it will make things better. But there's a reason we titled this conversation this morning, When Words Fall Short. People tried with us. They'd be like, hey, I know this is hard, but you will have another baby one day. And I know that they were saying that in an effort to comfort us. You probably had things said to you that just really weren't that helpful. And you've probably said things to others that really weren't that helpful, all in an effort to connect and comfort. But in my experience, there are no words for things that don't make sense. But it's probably also why I appreciate the next thing we see in Job's story. Job has 3 friends visit. When Job's 3 friends heard all about the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes, and they met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. And how do they do that? How do they comfort him? When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. For 7 days and 7 nights, they show up and they just sit by him. Everybody needs a couple of 7-day friends in their life because life will get hard and life will be exhausting and it will feel overwhelming and it will feel dark. And you need somebody, at least 1 or 2 somebodies, that will just come alongside you and be. That aren't trying to find the right words or fix it, they're just there. A few years ago, I was in a particularly dark season or frustrating season of parenting. And in retrospect, my kids were just figuring out their story. But in that moment, I was exhausted and overwhelmed. And I had a good group of friends around me, but I wasn't reaching out because, we don't bother anybody. We don't want to bother anybody. But I opened up my front door one day, and there was a bottle of wine and a bag of H-E-B cheese balls. And I was like, this helps. I know that when we don't know what to say, we do a couple things. We either try and fill the space with like platitudes or trite things, like cliche things that we've heard, or we just avoid the conversation altogether. Maybe we're so uncomfortable with their uncomfort that we don't lean into them. Just show up. You don't have to have the right words. Just be present. Just be there, because the people that you're sitting with, they don't know what to do or say either, but everybody needs someone to come alongside them. Now, eventually, Job's friends do talk. After 7 days and 7 nights, and when they talk a lot. Chapters 4 through 31 is actually them talking. And they have long, raw conversations about why did this happen? What do they think God is up to? Why would this happen to Job? Did Job deserve this? Was this because of this? Was this because, for chapter after chapter after chapter, trying to wrestle with the idea of why this happens. And when you step back and you look at their conversation, what you realize is that no one can actually grieve for you. And very few people can actually grieve alongside you for very long. No one can actually be in your exact shoes. And that loss you have experienced, no one can actually step right into that with you. Have you ever had a moment where your world just stopped and everybody rallied? All the meals were brought over and the condolences were sent. And then their life moved forward. And yours just was never the same. You know, I have had the same mentor since I was 29 years old. So for well over 15 years, she has guided me. She's encouraged me. She's corrected me. But she has 2 children that are about my age as well. And when we were in our mid-30s, her son Jamie died from leukemia. And the whole church rallied. And we did a good job. And I learned a ton navigating that season. But she even still will reflect that months to years later, she has said that, man, everybody's world kept going and ours stopped. Your world will stop. And you'll have to reach out and let people know that you need them. You know, people will try and say the right things, but people cannot grieve alongside you for long stints of time. And so I share that so one, you will need to reach out and let people know when you are struggling, when things are too much to bear. And the other reason I tell us that is because I think it's important, if you get the privilege of walking alongside someone, make a note about what happened. Set a reminder. I know that may seem weird, but if you open up my calendar, when I can remember, you'll see things like the day a marriage fell apart, or the day an addiction came to surface, or the day someone lost a job. It makes my calendar sound super depressing, I realize this. But let me tell you why I do this. I do this, one, because my life will keep moving forward, and in some ways, their world has stopped. And it's important to remember. I also do this because, to be honest, more often than not, I get to look at those things and I get to send a text that say, hey, do you remember 2 years ago you thought your marriage was over? Do you remember last year when you unexpectedly lost that job and you thought you'd never regain a sense of meaning and purpose, and look at what you've discovered now? Make a note. Set a reminder. It does matter. Now, the rest of Job is like some more long, raw conversations, and then finally Job gets an audience with God. And for several chapters, Job and God have an epic conversation for sure. And I think what Job presents to God, Job wants these answers, and God doesn't give him simple answers at all. In fact, I think we just actually oversimplify grief in general. Many of you may be familiar with the 5 stages of grief. It was a construct by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969 in her book On Death and Dying. And it highlights the stages that they think people move through when they're experiencing grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, these things were actually never meant to represent stair steps or a checklist, but I think our mind can't hear the term stages and not think of grief as something like we've got to get through it, or we've got to get over it, or we've got to move past it. When can I check off depression so I can just move to acceptance? How can I step over anger and bargaining and depression so I can move to acceptance? That was never her intention. Later in the 1990s, 2 other psychiatrists came along and developed a different kind of model for grieving, and it's called the dual process model. And for me, this model on how we navigate grief looks a lot more like grief feels. It's this idea that we move from this loss-oriented, meaning this is where we're looking at the grief. The pain is the focus. We are yearning, we are remembering, we are bargaining, we are angry, to restoration-oriented. We're taking on new roles, developing new relationships, new routines, stepping into new spaces, having moments filled with joy and gratitude. And we just ping-pong back and forth and back and forth, and sometimes landing in one point for a while and then darting back. The same memory, and our song can play or a memory can come in our mind, and that same memory and song can come up one time, and we are immediately thrust back into darkness, immediately thrust back into pain. And that exact same song and that exact same memory can come to your mind, and you can be filled with warmth and gratitude. This looks like grief feels to me. Is it possible that because of whatever you've experienced this year, who you've lost or what you've lost or how you've lost something, that you could be bouncing back and forth between this? Maybe you're trying to ignore it, but that irritability, especially now that it's amplified through the holidays, that thing that just feels off, that funk that you just can't quite shake, is it possible that you're experiencing grief, bouncing back and forth? Now, if I were to summarize Job's conversation with God over those several chapters, it goes pretty much something like this. Job says, hey, God, all this stuff has happened to me. And God goes, I know, I'm God. I'm God. I put the earth in motion. I set the stars in the sky. I'm well aware of what's happened to you. And Job goes, well, it doesn't make any sense. Why is all this happening? And God responds, yep, I'm still God. I ordered the universe, put breath in your lungs. I'm still God. And Job goes, but I don't get it. Did I do something wrong? And God goes, no, it's actually not about you at all. It's about me being God. See, God doesn't give Job, really, it doesn't feel like answers at all. What he gives Job is perspective. God doesn't give Job simple, trite answers. He gives him perspective. I am God. Now, I know that when we are in these moments, we think what we're going to want is answers. And the bigger the grief, the deeper the pain, the more we're going to want something that satisfies, that fills that emptiness, or help me make sense of something. But in my experience, there's nothing that makes sense of things that just don't make sense. And we think if I could just grab hold of this, then it would fill the void, or if I could grab hold of that, the pain would subside. But honestly, it's this reality that keeps me grounded through my most difficult moments. I know we think like, okay, I'll get this new job, but isn't it funny that unexpected firing doesn't like that ego being bruised, that doesn't feel better because you got a new job. That friend that betrayed you, so you've moved and now you've got a new friendship that's great, but wouldn't you have rather have had no betrayal at all? Yes, Sal and I had 2 other amazing baby boys, but I would have rather had 3. I know we think that something's going to fill the void and it's going to make it palatable. But for me, God has to be just God for me to reconcile any of my grief. God has to be beyond my comprehension, my understanding. So God, that's the only way I can actually bear the pain, is if God is so big and so beyond me that I can recognize that I don't understand my grief, but God still remains. Now, Job goes forward in life, and some things are changed in his life. Let's read what happens to Job next. After they've had this long, drawn conversation, the Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys, and he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. I've heard people use this part of Job's story to say, hey, look, if you remain faithful, if you remain upright and blameless, and you never curse God, in the end, it'll all make sense, and you'll get it all back even tenfold. But Job doesn't get everything back. The lives restored are never returned. The lives that are lost were never restored. We never get everything back. Things are going to be different, sometimes in just tiny, tiny ways. Sometimes in big, epic ways. But we never get everything back. Job's dynamic with God is not about God giving him things back. It's not about restoring what was. It's about renewing his perspective. It's about trust and perseverance even over returning items. It's going to be different. Whatever you've navigated, whatever change, whatever loss, that relationship status that changed, that work situation that changed, that financial situation that changed, it's probably not going to go back to the way it was. We never get everything back. But yet we read this, the very end of Job's story. And so Job died, an old man and full of years. Now, those are two words here. They're descriptors. We have old and full, and they are different on purpose, I think. Yes, Job lived to be old. He lived an old life, but he also lived a full life. And not in spite of what he experienced, but I think because of what he experienced, because of the joy and the pain, because of the good and the trouble, because of the gains and the losses, because we actually can't know or appreciate one without the other. But Job had to choose a full life. I know that we want things to make sense. I know we want to understand and we want to put everything up in like a bright, perfect package. But that's not how life works. Job's entire life is turned upside down. He loses everything he worked hard for. He loses nearly everyone he loved. He loses his own ability to function for a season. Now his friends show up, and they try and make sense of things, right? And he tries to make sense of things with God. Things do get better, but they never get the same. And yet somehow, Job chooses a full life. I know sitting with that, though, isn't easy. Because there is a reality that every transition we experience into something new will require the release of something that was. And every loss will extract some level of price from our heart. I know that doesn't make it easy. But our question this morning is really, God is not unaware of what you navigated this year or what you're walking toward, even through this holiday season. God's not unaware. The question this morning is, how aware are you? Are you aware of how that change in your season of life has impacted you? Are you aware of how dealing with that dynamic with your children or your parents or that ostracized family member or dealing with that transition at work or whatever it is, are you aware of how it's impacted you? Do you know? Are there things in your world that have just not been named as grief yet? Now, I know, in a message that's pretty heavy, feels pretty serious this morning, I know we want things wrapped up in a perfect package so you can go out smiling, and, I'll try, but really I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. The first thought that I want to leave you with is if there are things in your life, are there areas in your life where you have maybe not recognized that you're grieving? Has something changed? Someone that used to live with you no longer lives with you. What you thought was or could be or should be, it just simply isn't. And what would it look like for you to name it, to acknowledge it, not to ignore it? Doesn't necessarily mean to drown in it either, but just to say, I think I'm grieving this. I think I'm grieving that breakup. I think I'm grieving that change. I think I'm grieving that loss. Or I had this valued item that I spent my whole life saving up for, and now it's not working out. What would it look like for you to name the things that have changed and you have lost in your life? And then the second one is, if you are well aware that you are in a season of grieving for whatever reason, you probably don't need this, but I just kind of want to say it. You have permission to grieve. It makes sense that the holidays are going to be hard. You're not crazy. You may be bouncing back and forth between that model that we just looked at. One second feeling like, okay, I can breathe again, and the next feeling like you can't. You have permission to navigate that. Now, I cannot, if there's a way that we can help you come alongside, I'd love to do that. I won't be quiet for 7 days. I just need you to know that. There's no way in the world I can be quiet for 7 days. I could for sure give you 7 minutes, maybe 8. But you have permission to grieve. And the last, and for me the most important, I shared earlier about my mentor, Karen, and the loss of her son, Jamie. I learned so much from them, but I was there the night that Jamie died. And as I was in the hospital room and Karen entered the room and she realized that her son was gone. And she dropped to the floor and she just yelled, "No, not my son. No, not my son." At the exact same time, her husband went over to his son's bedside and he stood there and he said, "God, you are so good. You are so faithful. You are so good." Both those sentiments were in the same room at the same time. That's what Job is talking about. I cannot take the good and not the trouble. Months later, after all their 7-day friends had come and gone, they actually decided to take a cruise. After several years of fighting for Jamie's life, they just needed a reset, and they went on the cruise, and they were cruising around the Mediterranean, and she said she would sit at the dinner table or go to a show or go to a game or an excursion, and she would be like, he would have been here. He would have been on this trip with us. He should have been here. He would have been laughing at this. He would have been enjoying this moment. And then they ported in Rome, and they went to the tour of the Vatican like hundreds and thousands of people do every day. But she says there was this moment when they were in the Vatican, and they turned the corner, and Michelangelo's Pieta was there. And as she looked at that sculpture, she said, Jen, I looked at Mary holding her son when there was no life left in his body. She said, I just felt like God said, I know. I get it. I do know. You know, if I could leave you with anything, no matter what you're navigating this season, is that please understand that God is deeply aware of loss and change. And he knows it's hard. And not like in a been there, done that trite way. He has been betrayed. He has been abandoned. He has been forgotten. He has lost people he has loved. He has been chosen. He has been in it. He grieves for you. He grieves with you. And he has grieved. So when words fall short, and they absolutely will, there is a God that gets it so much more than you will remember when you're in the midst of your season. So you have permission this holiday season to feel whatever you feel. And if you're like, I just refuse to feel any of it, what would it look like to consider if maybe some of the changes and the transitions in your year have impacted you? You know, you cannot take the good and not the trouble, but you don't take any of it alone. God is deeply aware and deeply present, if you'll let him be. Let me pray for us. Father, I have no clue what everybody in this room has lost. I don't know about the changes in their world. I don't know about the transitions they've experienced this year. And I don't know what things the holidays are already amplifying and screaming in their heart and in their mind. But you are beyond aware. And if there are ways we're trying to shove things under a rug, ignore them, or even if there's ways we're over-identifying with things, God, would you just speak to us? As we bounce back and forth between being able to breathe and feeling like we can't breathe, would you just speak to us? That you would meet us exactly where we are with whatever change or transition or loss we've experienced. God, we choose to live a full life. We don't take the good and not the trouble. And we thank you that we take none of it alone. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys so much. Next week, we start our Christmas series.